John, I just want to thank you for joining us here in this hot Arizona August day. I think the AZ Impact for Good audience at the Unite conference really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for joining us and helping us demystify what systems change is. It's something that is a little wonky. It gets a little academic. And so that's why we wanted to bring you here and share your thoughts on what systems change is. And thank you to the FSG team for helping us kind of dilute that a little bit.
Thank you to you and everyone at Vitalist Health, the folks at AZ Impact. It's just an incredible opportunity to share. One of the things I'm prioritizing as I sort of set up FSG for the next phase is how do we move from the theoretical to the practical, sort of shift from that learned professor to that coach here to help. So hopefully that we help some folks out today.
That's great. That's great. So let's get into the basic things of what system change is, but I think at the most basic level, let's start by defining a system. What is a system?
Yeah, so I don't have my textbook definition in front of me, but at its core, it's a grouping of interdependent, interconnected parts, sort of gatherings of humans. Your community is a system. The organization that you work in, that's a system. The school in and of itself, that's a system, as is the school system. It's the acknowledgement that actually the relationship between players and systems is what creates the challenges that we see, much more than any one sort of nonprofit or any one solution, right? We can't just scale organization X and all of a sudden that's going to solve our problems. How do we start to see what else might be happening and get at some of those barriers, what we call sort of systemic conditions that are holding problems in place?
All right. And if you are knowledgeable about Vitalist Health, that's what we would refer to as the elements of a healthy community. So all the conditions that impact our overall well-being. So, everybody talks about it differently. John, let's get to its simplest form. What is systems change?
Yeah. So for us, we would say systems change is about shifting the systemic conditions that hold our problems in place. If we go back to that first definition of systems, it's acknowledging that the problems we see are not just about not enough services, not enough nonprofits holding something up. It's actually about different connections, other things happening in the system, and getting us to understand how do we address some of those systemic barriers. So to make that even more concrete, oftentimes when we think about systemic barriers, we think about the most explicit or structural elements of change. Things like policies, practices, resource flows. It's where most of us in the nonprofit sector play. It's where I played for the first 10, 15 years of my career, right? Those things are important, but in truth, there's so much more actually holding problems in place because in many instances, we've addressed the policy, we've addressed the practice, we've addressed the resource flows, and yet we still continue to see the disparities. And so I would argue system change is about understanding what else is happening in the ecosystem. How are we thinking about things like relationships and connections, like power dynamics, and perhaps most importantly, like the mental models that hold challenges in place? Once we bring that systems view, then it's about how do we actually start to address that work.
Yeah. Something you said in your talk a little earlier was when you're in the work, right, when you have a line of people 200 deep waiting for shelter in one night, right, it's hard to get out and think of things at the systems level. But why should nonprofits and foundations think of things at a systems level?
I appreciate you bringing this point back up because I think it's important. By me saying that so many of us focus on the structural, I am not suggesting that those things aren't important. In many ways, those are the things that actually help folks today, whereas the path towards systems change is long-term and it's challenging. So we should definitely continue to support practices, policies, and resource flows. And I really hope somebody's working on these other elements of the system, or else we're never going to long-term see the change that we're trying to achieve. So the invitation I have to many nonprofits and to funders as well is, talk to me about your mission. What is the system that mission is trying to shift? And would you argue that you're going to actually achieve that mission by only going at those type level things? If you can honestly answer that question and the answer is no, then the question is, where do we find space to do these other components? Now, this is also not an invitation for you to do everything, right? A system is a system because it has multiple actors. So no one human can do all the things. And what does it look like to be in relationship with some of the other folks? You got 200 folks lined up to do direct service, you should probably be doing direct service. Though I would argue you should be in relationship with the folks that do the policy work as well. And how do we maintain and build the spaces for those folks to come together?
All right, so as you talk about these interactions and everything that being interrelated, what are the common barriers that are there?
So we often say that sort of collaboration is the key, and collaboration is hard, right? The pointy elbows of do-gooders. It's hard in these streets. Budgets are real. I'm a nonprofit CEO as well. We are making difficult challenges and we're making difficult choices on a daily basis. So I would say one of the common barriers is folks say they want to collaborate and there's this expectation that it happens by osmosis, right? That just because I will it, all of a sudden we're going to figure it out. I think part of what FSG really stands on and part of what we've seen from practitioners across, frankly, the globe at this point is actually if we can bring some structure to this process, we can often unlock a lot of potential. So I would say, how do we think about funding the collaborative spaces as a key barrier? How do we ensure that as we're on the long-term path towards whatever the systems change or the collaborative effort we're working at might be, how are we ensuring that we're building immediate value right now? I'm a sort of teacher educator by training, and so a lot of my work is rooted in adult learning theory. Yeah. We as adults, when we learn something, need to be able to apply it immediately, or often the learning goes away. Okay. But how many learning spaces are we in where you walk away with this theoretical concept where you're like, oh, that was fun, and I guess I'll come back to it at some point. Right? Makes sense, yeah. And so I think that's the other piece. Folks get into this space and it feels academic. It feels expensive. It feels like something that requires so much more than what we have access to. And I think the reverse of that is actually helping folks see there's opportunities to braid this into your work constantly.
And so when you're talking about all this braiding, what kinds of questions should coalitions and individual members of these coalitions be asking themselves before entering a systems change journey?
So a couple things come to mind for me. One is, what does it look like for us to establish a shared vision, right? What do we want to be true for our community, regardless beyond what any one mission statement might be? What are we all working towards, and what does that shared vision look like? As a component of that shared vision, often the path to getting there is doing some flavor of systems analysis. Each of us are members of this system. Each have our own lived experiences and knowledge of how this work is taking shape. You need that knowledge and you need to harvest it. Actually, the process of harvesting and doing that analysis is often what builds the infrastructure necessary to ultimately achieve the work. So one, I would say, think about aligning that vision. How do you do this learning journey together to understand what's actually happening in your community? And then the last part I would say is, how do you continue to hold yourself accountable to who's around this table? Where are there folks that are missing? Importantly, where are the community members that are missing? But perhaps as equally important, where's the other sector that isn't present here? We did this work in St. Louis and was working with a community organizer, and she said, on my collaborative tables all the time, no one invites me to the collaborative tables of the civic leaders here, right? So we got our grassroots folks over here, you got your business folks over here. Sometimes the business folks talk to the civic folks, but we're not at those tables. Well, that defeats the point too, right? And I would argue there's growth on both sides to figure out how do we create those spaces that reach across. So one would be align on vision. Two would be go on that learning journey together to understand what are we addressing. And then three, keep an eye looking around the table. How are we bringing a cross-sector view? How are we centering community? How are we being thoughtful to maintain that space, really rooted in relationships and trust?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about involving community, right? We throw out words like health equity, and what that really means is not doing to community, but doing with community, and really making sure that that community who you want to impact, whose lives you want to improve, are part of the process.
Agreed. So. We often say the importance of striking between lived and learned experience, right? It'd be inappropriate and probably not real to say, oh, I have no point of view. I'm just going to do what the community says. Okay. That's not real life, right? There's things that you know based on your role, your power, your access that could actually benefit. And similarly, you need to understand what the community is asking for, right? And so how do we strike that balance between the lived experience, the person impacted by these things daily, and what is legitimate learned experience? And how do we respect both and get to the right answer that's captured in both?
John, thank you for telling us what systems change is. I think one thing I want to ask is, oftentimes we get organizations that are very passionate about their work, and they're working at that symptomatic level. So they're working on, feeding people with food boxes, or they're housing people overnight because they need shelter, right? So what kinds of things are not systems change?
So a couple things come to mind. Many of those things that you named feel like the direct service work that folks need. I would argue that occurring in isolation without intention and connection to others is not systems change. Once we figure out how that is working in partnership with other things happening inside your community, that's where this becomes systems change, right? And so are we strengthening the relationships and connections in the work? Is that what you're going after? Are we actually strengthening those relationships and connections in order to drive policy change? Have we started to think about the mental models present in our work? As a real simple example, if you got a bunch of folks who are doing direct service work, where's actually the opportunity for them to be honest with themselves about what's not working? Oftentimes that will get us to a systems change conversation and start to unlock what we might want to consider doing moving forward. So I would say it's the isolating factor. It's the only playing at the structural factor that often prevents something from becoming systems change. When we are intentional about finding those opportunities to braid, right? Finding those opportunities to address the more implicit and transformational barriers that are holding problems in place, that's when we're likely on the path towards some of that systems change work.
Great. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to let people know as they start this work?
Maybe the last thing I'll say is this work is hard. Like full transparency, I'm not trying to suggest it's easy. I have been in that seat where I got kids to feed today or kids to teach today, and you simultaneously want me to think about some of the broader opportunities. I just want to give a bit of empathy and honesty. Like, I hear you. I know it's hard. And if we're committed to the work, finding space to do some of this is real. So that's one. This is hard. What you're experiencing is real, right? Like, let's not be Pollyannish about it. The second one is, how do you think about some of the quick wins along the way? Systems change is long-term work. Let's take a system like systemic racism. It took much more than a couple of days in order to build it. And I would argue it's going to take much more than that 3 to 5 year grant cycle in order to resolve it, right? Yeah. So if we're not going to solve systemic racism tomorrow, what's the quick win along the way that keeps us engaged, that acknowledges the progress that we've made, and helps us understand what we can do next? Staying in that process is actually what keeps us committed to the long-term systems change vision.
Yeah, no, I think you said something earlier that was, we move at the speed of trust, right? And I think that's something that can often be overlooked in this work, and you need to take that time to build that trust, right? And that takes, months and sometimes years to really create. So thank you for everything that you just told us. Thank you for coming and joining us here in Arizona. Hopefully it wasn't too hot, but we'll continue to talk to you, and thank you for sharing all your work with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to share. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good one.